The airport was alive with the hum of early morning travelers, the mechanical purr of luggage wheels across polished floors, and the echo of announcements blending into a familiar symphony of departures and arrivals. Elliot Grayson paused just inside the entrance, taking in the scene with a subtle smile. He wore a well-worn leather jacket over a simple t-shirt and jeans, unassuming, comfortable, a stark contrast to the tailored suits he wore in boardrooms. This wasn't a day for standing out, it was a day for blending in. Elliot wasn't just another passenger. He was the CEO and founder of Unity Air, a rapidly growing airline company that prided itself on affordability, quality, and inclusivity. Today, he would fly as a customer, noting the small details that defined the traveler's experience, from the check-in process to the seating comfort. This, he believed, was how a leader stayed connected with their vision, by living it firsthand. Unbeknownst to him, a set of watchful eyes followed his every move. Jake Harmon, a seasoned airport security officer with a sharp gaze, had been observing passengers for years, trained to notice behaviors that deviated from the norm. Today, he was particularly tense. A night of restless sleep and personal worries had left him on edge. As Elliot approached the security line, his casual attire and confident stride caught Jake's attention. There was nothing overtly suspicious about him, but a whisper of instinct, tainted by subtle biases that Jake himself might not have recognized, urged him to pay closer attention. "Step this way, sir," Jake said, his voice clipped. Elliot raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. "Is there an issue?" Elliot asked calmly. "Just a random check," Jake replied, though the tightening of his jaw suggested otherwise. Elliot, used to unexpected detours in his professional life, nodded and stepped aside, suppressing a sigh. He knew better than to resist, even as an unease settled in the pit of his stomach. Jake's gaze hardened as he scanned Elliot's ID and ticket. The interaction was routine, yet there was an underlying tension. Elliot's name, unfamiliar to Jake, did not raise any alarms. But his mind, strained and restless, kept searching for a flaw, a break in the normal. "What brings you here today?" Jake asked, his tone straying from casual to intrusive. Elliot's calm demeanor wavered, but he responded evenly, "Flying out for work." "To where?" "San Francisco," Elliot said, meeting Jake's eyes. The challenge in his gaze was subtle, a question unspoken. "Why are you questioning me?" The silence stretched between them, weighted and uncomfortable. Around them, other travelers shifted, some murmuring to themselves, others averting their eyes. The airport's ambient noise seemed to fade into the background as the scrutiny continued. "Can you step into this room for further questioning?" Jake said, gesturing to a small side office. Elliot's patience began to wear thin, but he followed, aware that confrontation would only escalate matters. In the room, under fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows, Jake's questioning took a sharper turn. The questions strayed from protocol, touching on why Elliot's travel plans seemed unusual and whether he had any affiliations he should disclose. Elliot's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward. "I think I've answered enough," he said, his voice steady but strained. "Is there a reason why you're asking these questions, officer?" Jake's face hardened, defensive. He glanced at the ID again, as if willing it to show something different. But it didn't. "It's just procedure," Jake said finally, an edge of defensiveness coloring his voice. "It doesn't feel like that," Elliot countered softly, a hint of controlled anger sparking in his eyes. Voices from outside filtered into the room. A small crowd had gathered, some curious, others visibly concerned. The muffled click of phones capturing the moment sent a chill down Jake's spine. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. Elliot stood up, every inch of him exuding frustration. "Am I being detained?" he asked. Jake's mouth opened, then closed. His training screamed at him to de-escalate, but the room felt too tight, the air too charged. Before he could respond, a voice from the doorway cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" The airport manager, a wiry man with gray hair and a sharp expression, stepped inside. His eyes darted between the two men. Elliot glanced at Jake, then at the manager. "Just a misunderstanding, I hope." The manager's eyes narrowed, taking in the scene with an experienced eye. "Officer Harmon, a word, please." The room emptied, leaving Elliot standing alone for a moment before a junior officer came to escort him out. As he stepped into the terminal, the crowd dispersed, whispers trailing behind him. The confrontation had not ended with cuffs or raised voices, but the sting of humiliation was fresh. He walked to his gate, head held high, but his mind churned. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The hours after the confrontation were a blur for both Elliot and Jake. For Elliot, sitting in the lounge of his gate, every whispered comment and sidelong glance felt like a reminder of the incident. News of what had transpired was spreading quickly. Murmurs and sympathetic nods from passers-by told him that the video of the incident was already making the rounds online. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages, some from close friends and colleagues, others from journalists hungry for his comment. He ignored them all, needing space to process his anger and disbelief. How many times had he, as a black man who defied expectations, been underestimated or scrutinized unfairly? This moment, however, stung deeper. This time, it was at the heart of the very company he had built to symbolize opportunity and unity. Meanwhile, Jake sat in the airport security office, the sharp reprimand of his supervisor echoing in his ears. His hands were clammy, his thoughts a tangled mess of guilt and justification. The thin file on his desk, marked with Elliot's name, felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The reprimand was just the beginning. The internal investigation would follow, and until then, he was on administrative leave. "What were you thinking, Jake?" asked Captain Marlowe, his supervisor, with a voice that cut through the room like ice. Jake had no answer. His gut told him he'd been wrong, but his pride choked any admission. The room fell silent as Marlowe shook his head and dismissed him. Jake left the office with a mix of humiliation and uncertainty. The world outside the glass doors of the office seemed too bright, too noisy. His gaze followed Elliot, now boarding the plane, and a pang of regret struck deep. Elliot's flight was quiet, save for the occasional ding of seatbelt lights and the low hum of the engines. He sat by the window, staring at the rolling clouds, wrestling with his thoughts. Despite everything, he didn't want the narrative to spiral out of control. He had worked hard to build Unity Air into a company that fostered diversity and welcomed all backgrounds. Letting anger guide his next steps would undermine the very values he sought to uphold. The moment the plane touched down, he knew the next move was to address the situation, not with outrage, but with a message of resilience and unity. He drafted a brief statement to share publicly, choosing words that called for reflection without shying away from the truth of what had happened. His voice, he decided, would not be one of division, but of challenge, challenging both the system and himself to strive for better. Jake, on the other hand, faced a sleepless night. The reality of his actions played over in his mind, a broken loop of doubt and regret. He flipped through old photo albums, trying to remember a time when his job was just about keeping people safe. When had it become about suspicion first? Fairness second? His mind roamed to his own struggles, the losses he'd faced, and the grudges that had slowly poisoned his perspective. In the darkness of his living room, he felt the first crack in the wall of his defenses. Days passed, and the airport's response to the incident intensified. Unity Air released Elliot's statement, which quickly went viral. Its tone, calling for understanding, fairness, and systemic change, resonated with thousands. It wasn't just a story of an entrepreneur wronged. It was a story of how often these experiences occurred and what they meant for society at large. Surprisingly, amidst the sea of messages, Elliot received one from an unexpected source, Jake Harmon. It was brief and filled with hesitance, but it was there, an apology, an attempt at owning his mistakes. Elliot read it twice, then once more, searching for sincerity between the lines. "I'd like to speak if you're willing," the message concluded. Elliot's immediate reaction was resistance. He didn't owe Jake a conversation, let alone forgiveness. But as he sat in his office, the memories of others who had shown him understanding during hard times surfaced. What if this meeting could prevent another person from experiencing what he had? With a deep breath, he typed back, "Let's meet." The meeting was set in a neutral space, a quiet room in Unity Air's headquarters, far from the bustling terminals and the place of their first encounter. Jake arrived early, dressed in civilian clothes, and sat nervously at the conference table. He glanced at the clean lines of the room, the portraits on the wall depicting diverse employees and passengers. Every face seemed to watch him, silently questioning his presence. Elliot entered with an air of calm, his posture upright, his gaze assessing. He took a seat across from Jake, folding his hands together. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elliot nodded but didn't rush to fill the silence. He wanted Jake to speak first, to show that this was more than just an obligatory appearance. "I was wrong," Jake finally admitted, his eyes meeting Elliot's. There was a tremor in his voice that hinted at vulnerability. "I let assumptions cloud my judgment." "It was unfair? And it was wrong?" Elliot studied him, seeing past the uniformed officer to the man beneath, a man grappling with the realization of his actions. The room felt heavy, the air thick with unspoken pain and reluctant hope. "Why?" Elliot asked after a pause, the single word laced with both challenge and curiosity. Jake exhaled, looking away before his eyes found Elliot's again. "I'd like to say it was just a bad day, but that's not true. It was years of not questioning myself, of seeing people as roles rather than individuals. I'm sorry." For the first time since their confrontation, Elliot felt a shift, a small, cautious movement toward understanding. He didn't offer forgiveness outright, it wasn't time. But he offered something that felt almost as powerful, an opportunity. "Actions matter more than words, Jake," Elliot said, his voice steady. "If you mean what you say, show it." Jake nodded, the weight of the moment pressing into his chest. "I will." The story would continue to follow Jake's journey through sensitivity training and community work, while Elliot works to expand Unity Air's initiatives to promote inclusivity. Their paths would cross in increasingly collaborative ways, showcasing how redemption and understanding are earned through action and perseverance. The climax builds when they jointly address an industry conference, reflecting on their shared story as an example of change and growth. Would you like me to proceed with a more detailed outline or specific chapter expansions? The meeting between Elliot and Jake, though necessary, left Elliot feeling unsettled. He replayed Jake's apology in his mind, noting the sincerity but also the hesitation. It was one thing to admit fault. It was another to take responsibility in a way that mattered. The words "show it" echoed in Elliot's thoughts as he left the office that day. Elliot returned to his home, a modern loft overlooking the city, and sank into his chair. The day's tension pressed down on him, weighing him with questions he wasn't ready to face. Was he too harsh? Did offering an opportunity for redemption undermine the seriousness of what had happened? He looked out at the twinkling lights below and realized that forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetfulness. It was a pathway, not an erasure. Across town, Jake sat in his darkened living room. The meeting had stripped away any pretense of comfort he clung to. The conversation with Elliot was replaying in his head, every pause and gaze dissected. His heart thudded with the reality that change required more than a confession. It required action, humility, and time. 3 things he wasn't sure he could offer adequately. But he knew he had to try. Over the next few weeks, Jake started attending sensitivity training sessions required by the airport. At first, the sessions felt mechanical, just another task on a checklist. But as the weeks passed, the stories shared by trainers and attendees began to sink in. These were stories of passengers who had been unfairly profiled, employees who faced biases at work, and community members who experienced life in a world that sometimes refused to see them for who they were. One story that stood out was from Maria Rivera, an airport staff member who described being scrutinized simply because her background and accent didn't fit the preconceived image of a manager. The session was a turning point for Jake, who felt her words resonate deep within. He saw his own habits mirrored back to him, unflinching and raw. At the same time, Elliot worked with his team at Unity Air to enhance diversity training and community outreach. He doubled down on efforts to create workshops that would educate staff on the power of implicit biases. To Elliot, this was more than damage control. It was a mission to ensure that Unity Air embodied the values it stood for. The day came when Jake reached out to Elliot again, this time with an offer instead of an apology. He proposed collaborating on one of Unity Air's upcoming training sessions, not as an officer, but as someone who had learned firsthand what it meant to confront biases. Jake was clear. He didn't expect absolution, just a chance to contribute to change. Elliot considered the proposal carefully. It was a risky move. Associating with Jake could spark backlash, but it could also symbolize the type of transformation Unity Air aimed to inspire. He agreed on the condition that Jake attend as both a participant and a contributor, sharing his experience as a cautionary tale. The training day arrived with anticipation thick in the air. The room was filled with Unity Air staff, airport security officers, and guests from the community. Jake stood at the edge of the stage, nerves gnawing at him, but determination steeling his spine. Elliot introduced him with a tone that was neutral but firm, setting the expectation that this wasn't a performance but a lesson. Jake spoke candidly about that day at the airport, the misguided certainty that led him to judge unfairly, and the hard road he had traveled since then to unlearn what he thought he knew. He shared moments of shame, like facing his own family and admitting his failures, and moments of growth, like listening to stories that mirrored the very behavior he had once justified. The room, once tense, softened. Heads nodded, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. It wasn't forgiveness that hung in the air, it was understanding. When he stepped down, Elliot gave him a nod that felt like the first step toward something more. After the training session, Elliot and Jake sat in a small, quiet corner of the room. The conversation that followed was different from their first meeting. It was less about Jake's guilt and more about the future. "I've been thinking," Elliot said, breaking the silence. "What if we take this further? Workshops, yes, but also mentorship programs and scholarships for young people who want to go into aviation and law enforcement. Programs that show that integrity is built, not assumed." Jake felt a spark of hope light within him. "I'd like that. I want to be part of that." The moment wasn't charged with emotion or tension, but with purpose. It was the start of something neither of them had planned, but both knew was necessary. They agreed to meet again, this time to draft plans that would take Unity Air's mission beyond words and into the community. Over the next few months, Unity Air's community programs took shape. Workshops turned into interactive panels where people from different backgrounds shared stories and insights, not just about travel, but about life and perspective. Scholarships were established for underrepresented youth interested in aviation careers. The programs bore the tagline, "See Beyond." Jake became a fixture at these events, not as an officer, but as a mentor. He spoke candidly to young people about what it meant to hold power responsibly, and what he learned about humility. His transformation was evident, not in grand gestures, but in the way he listened, the questions he asked, and the respect he showed. Elliot watched as the company he built became more than just an airline. It became a catalyst for change, sparking dialogue and reflection far beyond its terminals. Months later, a large conference on diversity and inclusivity in aviation brought together leaders, activists, and industry members. Elliot and Jake stood side by side on the stage, ready to share their journey. Elliot spoke first, setting the context and vision for Unity Air's programs. He talked about the confrontation, not in bitterness, but as a catalyst for the good that followed. Jake followed with his story, not sparing himself from the details that painted him in an unflattering light. But as he spoke about growth and change, the audience listened. The conclusion of his speech wasn't applause, it was silence, the kind that spoke to reflection. Finally, Elliot turned to Jake, extending his hand. "We've got more to do," he said. Jake took it, a small smile breaking the tension in his expression. "We're just getting started." The story concluded with Unity Air's newest program taking flight. Mentorships that matched young people with mentors in various fields. The image of Elliot and Jake working side by side became emblematic of the broader message that mistakes didn't have to define you if you chose to learn and make amends. Jake's journey from an officer who misused power to an advocate for inclusivity was no longer just a story. It was a testament to the power of introspection, growth, and the belief that change is always possible. Elliot looked out the window of Unity Air's newest plane, one that bore the tagline "See Beyond" beneath the company logo. The horizon stretched wide, promising a future built not just on ambition, but on understanding. The next months were transformative not just for Unity Air, but for the communities it served. The scholarship program, launched under the tagline "See Beyond," drew hundreds of applications. Young people from underrepresented backgrounds, with dreams of aviation and law enforcement careers, found themselves welcomed into a nurturing environment that promised support and growth. Elliot visited schools and community centers, speaking about resilience and ambition. His story of facing prejudice, not as an endpoint, but as a turning point, inspired many. Parents and teachers noted how their students' eyes lit up with hope, knowing that someone who had once been questioned unfairly had turned that moment into a force for change. Meanwhile, Jake continued his work as a mentor. The once gruff officer became known for his compassion, especially among young recruits in training academies. He shared not just techniques and protocols, but lessons on empathy and perspective. It wasn't uncommon for him to pause in a lecture, take a deep breath, and share stories of what he learned when he failed to see beyond the surface. These stories, both Elliot's and Jake's, began to resonate far beyond their city. Media outlets picked up on their unusual partnership, labeling it a model for reconciliation and progress. Interviews followed, not for the purpose of spectacle, but to highlight what true accountability and cooperation could achieve. As with any movement that gained momentum, not everyone agreed with their approach. Critics accused Elliot of being too lenient, too willing to offer second chances in a world that seemed to rarely extend the same kindness to others. Some believed that Jake's newfound role was undeserved, that redemption wasn't owed but earned. Elliot took these critiques to heart. He spent long nights considering if he had chosen the right path, questioning if his message of unity was too idealistic. But when he spoke to those impacted by the programs, students who now believed they had a chance, community members who felt seen and respected, he knew he couldn't back down from what they were building. Jake faced similar backlash. Some of his former colleagues treated him with skepticism, unsure if his transformation was genuine or performative. There were moments when the weight of doubt threatened to pull him back into old patterns. But the trust he was slowly building with the new generation kept him steady. Elliot and Jake met often to discuss these challenges, their once tense interactions now marked by mutual support. "We're not going to change everyone's mind," Elliot said one day, as they sat in his office overlooking the city. "But we don't need to. We just need to change enough to make a difference." Jake nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle deep within him. "One person at a time," he said. The culmination of their collaborative efforts was a large, open-forum event held at the city's largest community center. The event, titled "Bridging the Divide: Lessons in Empathy and Growth," brought together hundreds of attendees, from industry leaders to local families. Panel discussions featured voices from various backgrounds: pilots, police officers, educators, and community leaders, all sharing insights on building a more inclusive future. Elliot opened the event with a powerful speech that recounted not just his experiences, but the shared journey with Jake. "Growth isn't comfortable," he said, looking out at the faces in the crowd. "But it is necessary, and it's something we do not alone, but together." Jake followed with a speech that surprised even those who had become familiar with his story. He didn't just recount his mistakes. He spoke about the importance of accountability and action. "Apologies are where change begins," he said, "but they can't be where it ends." The event was punctuated by workshops and breakout sessions, allowing attendees to engage directly with mentors and panelists. Jake led one such session, his words encouraging young recruits to approach their future roles with integrity and awareness. At the end of the day, a young man approached Jake. He wore a security uniform, newly minted. "I used to think showing weakness was the worst thing an officer could do," the young man said. "But now I see it's actually not growing that's the failure." Jake smiled, a small but significant victory in his ongoing journey. The weeks following the event were filled with positive developments. Unity Air's scholarship program expanded, with new partnerships forming with training academies and universities. Elliot's inbox was filled with stories from scholarship recipients who shared how the program changed the trajectory of their lives. The mentorships, led by a team that included Jake, flourished. Jake's work was featured in a prominent magazine, not as a hero, but as an example of how the past does not have to dictate the future. The article was titled, "Rebuilding Trust, the Power of Honest Change." For Jake, seeing those words in print was surreal, a reminder of the long path he had taken from the incident that started it all. Elliot found himself at peace, knowing that while the road had been difficult, it had been worth it. He had turned anger into action, humiliation into progress, and division into collaboration. And in the process, he realized that leadership wasn't just about ambition, but about lifting others up, even those who had once stood in the way. Elliot and Jake's partnership had not just influenced their city, but had begun inspiring others around the country. Invitations came in from schools, police departments, and businesses interested in replicating their model. But the most touching request came from a small town where a community center wrote, asking if they could come speak to inspire hope among youth who felt overlooked. Elliot and Jake traveled to that town, meeting children and teens who asked them about resilience, fairness, and how to overcome setbacks. One question from a girl with wide eyes and a determined voice stood out. "How do you keep going when people doubt you?" Elliot glanced at Jake and smiled. "You keep going because change doesn't happen overnight," he said. "It happens because you keep showing up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." The final chapter brings Elliot and Jake full circle. Unity Air, once a company with a bold vision, had become a beacon for what was possible when commitment met courage. The last scene features them at the launch of a new Unity Air terminal, designed with input from community leaders and employees to be a place where every traveler felt valued. Jake watched as families, travelers, and employees filled the terminal. He caught sight of Elliot greeting guests with a warm smile. The atmosphere was a testament to what they had accomplished together. As Elliot joined Jake, the noise of the bustling terminal faded into the background. They stood side by side, looking out at the world that, while still imperfect, had become a little bit better because they dared to try. "Think we're done?" Jake asked, half smiling. "Not even close," Elliot said, the determination in his voice strong as ever. The final words of the story echo in the scene's quiet resolve. Change isn't an endpoint, it's a journey, and we're just getting started.